The story of Albert Speer is not merely a biography, it is a case study in seduction. It is the tale of how a nation was seduced by a dictator, and how that dictator, in turn, was seduced by an image, the image of a cultured, modern, and brilliant architect who promised to build 1,000-year Reich in stone and steel. This is where the myth of Albert Speer, the good Nazi, was born, not in a courtroom, but on a drawing board. He was, first and foremost, the architect of illusions. Before the war, before the armaments, and before the moral abyss, there was a young man from a wealthy, bourgeois family, seemingly apolitical, who found his purpose in a Berlin auditorium in 1930. He went to hear a political speech, but he was not won over by ideology. He was captivated by aesthetics. Adolf Hitler, the speaker, did not present himself as a raving demagogue to Speer that night, but as an artist manqué, a fellow dreamer of grand designs. For Speer, an architect struggling to find his place, this was a revelation. Here was a politician who spoke not of tariffs or treaties, but of culture, of rebuilding a humiliated Germany into a civilization that would dwarf Rome. Hitler was not just offering a political program, he was offering a canvas. Speer joined the Nazi Party almost immediately, not out of deep-seated antisemitism or fervent nationalism, but because he saw in Hitler a patron of unparalleled scale. His talent was undeniable, and his ambition, though carefully masked by a demeanor of quiet competence, was immense. He quickly ingratiated himself with the party's inner circle, beginning with small commissions, renovations and interior designs. His breakthrough came with a masterstroke of theatricality. In 1933, Joseph Goebbels tasked him with designing the setting for the Nazi Party's massive May Day rally at Tempelhofer Field. Speer did not just arrange flags and podiums. He conceived an environment. His genius lay in understanding that the Nazi message needed a physical embodiment, an architecture of power that was both overwhelming and sublime. He used towering banners, massive eagle insignias, and, most famously, his pioneering use of cathedrals of light, 130 anti-aircraft searchlights surrounding the field, their beams piercing the night sky to create a celestial colonnade. It was an illusion of divine sanction and invincible power, and it was utterly mesmerizing. Hitler was enthralled. This was the grandeur he had imagined, made real. This success led to the commission that would define Speer's pre-war career, the redesign of Berlin. Hitler dreamed of transforming the city into Germania, the world capital. Speer was his chosen instrument. His plans were monstrous in their scale. He designed a gargantuan Great Hall, with a dome so vast it would have its own weather system, capable of holding 180,000 people. He planned a triumphal arch dwarfing the Arc de Triomphe, and a central boulevard designed for military parades that would last for hours. These were not just buildings, they were psychological weapons, designed to crush the individual human spirit under the weight of the collective state. They were the ultimate illusion, the illusion that this regime was not a violent, chaotic movement, but a permanent, eternal, and legitimate world power. It was here that Speer crafted his facade with meticulous care. While other Nazi leaders like Göring, Himmler, and Goebbels appeared as grotesque, fanatical, or corrupt, Speer presented himself as something different, the apolitical technocrat. He was the well-mannered, handsome, and sophisticated artist, a man who spoke the language of culture and efficiency, not racial hatred. He was cultured, quoting Goethe and Schiller. He was modern, embracing American management techniques. He was, to the outside world and, most importantly, to himself, the acceptable face of National Socialism. This was his most brilliant architectural achievement, the construction of his own persona. He built a wall between his artistic, clean work and the brutal reality of the regime he served. He claimed he was merely fulfilling his duty as an architect, that the politics were not his concern. This illusion was so potent that it blinded even those who should have known better. Foreign diplomats and journalists were often disarmed by him. He was not a monster, he was a man they could talk to. He was Hitler's favorite because he was the only one who could translate the Führer's incoherent, megalomaniacal fantasies into clean, precise blueprints. Their relationship was not just that of a leader and his subordinate, it was that of an artist and his most gifted protégé. Speer provided the aesthetic validation Hitler so desperately craved. He made Nazism look beautiful. But the foundation of this beautiful illusion was rotten. The stone for Germania was to be quarried by slaves from concentration camps. The land for his grand avenues was to be cleared by the forced eviction of Jews. His architecture was intrinsically linked to the regime's cruelty, yet he maintained the illusion of detachment. He was not building for a political party, he claimed, he was building for Germany. He was the architect of illusions, and the first and most crucial person he had to convince was himself. As he stood over his models of a gleaming, monumental Berlin, he could ignore the storm gathering on the horizon, a storm that his own creations would soon help to unleash. The facade was perfect, but it was only a facade, and like all illusions, it was destined to crumble. The death of Fritz Todt in a mysterious plane crash in February 1942 was more than a tragedy, it was a transfer of power. Todt, the brilliant engineer who had built the West Wall and the Autobahns, lay dead in the smoldering wreckage. And waiting in the pre-dawn cold of Hitler's wolf's lair was Albert Speer, the architect, the aesthete, the man of grand designs. In that moment, the illusion of the apolitical artist shattered, replaced by the brutal reality of total war. Hitler, without hesitation, appointed Speer as the new Minister of Armaments and War Production. The architect of stone and light was now tasked with building the most terrible machine of all, the engine of the Nazi war effort. The drawing board was swapped for a factory floor, and Germania was forgotten. The new project was annihilation, and Speer's workshop was the entire German Reich. His ascent was not just a promotion, it was a metamorphosis. The man who had spoken of cultural renewal now spoke of production quotas, raw material allocations, and machine hour efficiency. And with a terrifying swiftness, he proved to be a genius. The German economy, which had been a chaotic and inefficient patchwork of competing party fiefdoms under the so-called leadership principle, was rationalized and centralized under his command. He dismantled the bureaucratic strangulation that had hampered production. He instituted a system of industrial self-responsibility, empowering factory managers and technical experts, many of whom were not ardent Nazis but pragmatic businessmen, to make decisions based on efficiency, not ideology. He created centralized planning committees that cut through the red tape of the party, the SS, and the Wehrmacht. For the first time, Germany began to wage war with the full, organized force of its industrial potential. Speer's methods were revolutionary. He implemented a system of crude but effective mass production, standardizing designs for everything from tanks to aircraft. The Panzer IV, the workhorse of the German army, saw its production time slashed. The output of ammunition, rifles, and artillery pieces skyrocketed. He famously staged armament miracles, where he would gather industrialists in Berlin, present them with seemingly impossible production targets, and through a combination of flattery, pressure, and the sheer force of his own belief, compel them to agree. He was not just a manager, he was a propagandist for production, creating a new cult of efficiency where the highest form of service to the right was to meet one's quota. Under his leadership, German war production did not just increase, it tripled between 1942 and 1944, even as Allied bombers rained destruction on German cities from the sky. This was the second, and most damning, stage of Speer's great illusion. He had created the facade of the cultured intellectual. Now, he crafted the persona of the modern, apolitical technocrat. He presented himself as a managerial wizard, a man who was simply applying rational principles to a complex problem. He was, he would later claim, just doing his duty, making the trains run on time. This was a seductive lie. The foundation of his miracle was not just rational organization, it was slavery on an unprecedented scale. The devil's workshop was powered by the sweat and blood of millions. Speer's insatiable demand for labor became the single greatest driver of the Nazi slave economy. He worked hand in glove with Fritz Sauckel, the plenipotentiary for labor deployment, who scoured occupied Europe for human fodder. Factories under Speer's jurisdiction, especially those building his precious fighter aircraft and V-2 rockets, became death traps. He toured the subterranean factories of the Mittelwerk, where the V-2 rockets were assembled by emaciated prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp under conditions of unimaginable horror. He saw the corpses being carried out. He knew the price. In memos and meetings, he coldly calculated the cost-benefit analysis of feeding these workers versus working them to death. Their efficiency, he so prized, was predicated on the fact that this workforce was expendable, a renewable resource to be consumed and discarded. The man who had built cathedrals of light was now the master of a subterranean hell. His relationship with Hitler during this period was at its zenith. He was their Führer's unproblematic friend, the one man who delivered tangible results while others brought only problems and defeats. While the generals on the Eastern Front reported disaster, Speer reported rising production graphs. He provided Hitler with the one thing he desperately needed after Stalingrad: hope. Hope that technology and sheer industrial might could still turn the tide. Speer fed the illusion that the war could still be won, not through strategy, but through production. He became indispensable, the magician who could conjure armies and air fleets from the ruins of the Reich. Yet, this period also sowed the seeds of his later defense. He would claim that he was only doing his job, that he was blind to the ultimate purpose of the machinery he built. But the truth was in the blueprints. He was not an innocent engineer, he was a high priest in the cult of total war. He had mobilized an economy, but in doing so, he had also prolonged the war. Every Tiger tank that rolled off the production line in 1944, every Focke-Wulf fighter that challenged Allied bombers over Berlin, every shell fired in the Ardennes offensive was a testament to his effectiveness. They were instruments of death that extended the conflict by months, perhaps even a year, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. The Devil's Workshop did not just supply the war, it sustained it. Albert Speer, the architect of illusions, had become the great enabler of the Third Reich's final, most destructive act. He had proven that a civilized man, armed with a slide rule and organizational charts, could serve a barbaric cause with an efficiency that no fanatic could ever match. Until the winter of 1943, Albert Speer's world was one of geometric certainty. It was a world of clean lines on drafting paper, of precise production schedules, and of an unshakable faith in the man who presided over it all. Adolf Hitler was not just his Führer, he was his patron, his confidant, the visionary whose dreams Speer was privileged to translate into reality. This relationship, built on a shared passion for monumental architecture, had thus far been insulated from the grim realities of the war. But war, with its inherent chaos, has a way of intruding upon the most carefully constructed sanctuaries. The intrusion came in the form of a single, cataclysmic event: the annihilation of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a seismic shock that reverberated through the very foundations of the Nazi state, and it sent the first, unmistakable crack through the facade of Albert Speer's unwavering belief. The crisis unfolded with a terrible, slow-motion inevitability. From his privileged position within Hitler's inner circle at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, Speer watched the drama play out. He was present in the map room as the red arrows of the Soviet encirclement closed around General Paulus's forces. He heard the confident assurances of Hitler and his generals that the pocket could be held, that it could be supplied by air, that it was a fortress and not a trap. Speer, the master of logistics and material calculation, would have understood the numbers. The tonnage of supplies needed to sustain 250,000 men in a Russian winter versus the Luftwaffe's actual capacity was an equation that did not balance. Yet, he remained silent, his faith in Hitler's strategic intuition, an intuition that had conquered France in a matter of weeks, still largely intact. He was, after all, the architect and the production chief, not a military strategist. The turning point was not the encirclement itself, but Hitler's response to it. Speer witnessed the transformation of the rational, artistically minded leader he admired into a figure of rigid, almost delusional, defiance. The order demanding that the Sixth Army stand fast and fight to the last man was not just a military command, it was an act of ideological fanaticism that prioritized a symbolic will to victory over the lives of 250,000 soldiers. For Speer, whose entire professional identity was built on pragmatic problem-solving, this was an incomprehensible calculus. He saw the human cost not as an abstract concept, but in the faces of the generals who pleaded for a breakout, in the grim reports that filtered in, and in the growing despair that permeated the headquarters. A pivotal, and often recounted, moment came during a shared meal in the mess hall of the Wolf's Lair. Hitler, in a monologue delivered to his stunned entourage, began to speak not of how to save the Sixth Army, but of the lesson its sacrifice would teach. He declared that the tragedy of Stalingrad was necessary, for it would harden the German people and show the world the unyielding determination of National Socialism. He spoke of the classical precedent of Leonidas at Thermopylae, a heroic last stand for a greater cause. To Speer, this was a horrifying revelation. The man he had revered as a grand strategist was, in this moment, revealed to be a grand mythmaker, willing to sacrifice an entire army for a narrative. The connection between means and ends, so clear in Speer's own work, had been severed in Hitler's mind. The architect, who built with tangible materials, was confronted by a politician who built with blood and symbols. The final surrender of the German forces in Stalingrad in early February 1943 confirmed Speer's nascent fears. The news fell over the headquarters like a pall. The propaganda machine of Joseph Goebbels scrambled to frame the defeat as a heroic epic, but within the inner sanctum, there was no disguising the truth. This was an unmitigated catastrophe. For Speer, the psychological impact was profound. The belief in Hitler's infallibility, a cornerstone of his world, had been fractured. If the Führer could be so catastrophically wrong about Stalingrad, what else was he wrong about? The grand strategy for the entire Eastern Front was now cast in doubt. This first crack of doubt did not, however, lead to an immediate rupture. Speer's sense of loyalty and his deeply ingrained habit of obedience were too strong. Moreover, his own power and identity were inextricably linked to the regime. Instead of leading to open opposition, the doubt manifested as a subtle but critical shift in his perspective. He began to see his own role not just as a servant fulfilling the Führer's will, but as a pragmatist who had to compensate for the leadership's growing detachment from reality. His drive to increase armaments production became more frantic, almost desperate. It was as if he believed that by sheer industrial output, he could build a wall of steel and fire to hold back the consequences of Hitler's strategic folly. The war was no longer a certain path to victory, but a looming disaster that only superhuman effort might avert. The man who emerged from the shadow of Stalingrad was different from the one who had entered it. The pure, uncritical faith was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and a dawning realization of the abyss towards which Germany was hurtling. He continued to perform his duties with his trademark efficiency, but now a chilling question must have begun to form in the back of his mind. If the man at the helm was steering the ship towards destruction, what was the responsibility of the chief engineer? The first crack of doubt had appeared, and though it was papered over with duty and production charts, it would never truly be repaired. It was the beginning of a slow, internal unraveling that would forever separate the Albert Speer of the early, triumphant years from the man who would later stand in the dock at Nuremberg. Their armament miracle was a lie. It was a narrative of graphs ascending, of production lines humming, of technological prowess overcoming material disadvantage. This was the public face of Albert Speer's empire, the story he told the world and, perhaps, himself. But behind the statistics, beneath the concrete ceilings of underground factories, and woven into the very fabric of every tank and shell produced, was the secret. It was not a secret of engineering or management, but of human suffering on an industrial scale. The true engine of the German war machine from 1942 onward was not Speer's genius for organization, but the systematic, brutal exploitation of millions of enslaved human beings. The factory, the temple of modern efficiency, had been transformed into an annex of the concentration camp. Upon taking office, Speer inherited a sprawling, chaotic system of labor procurement. He immediately set about rationalizing it with the same cold precision he applied to machine tool allocation. He did not create the slave labor system, but he perfected it, integrating it seamlessly into his grand industrial design. His ministry worked in a macabre symbiosis with Fritz Sokol, the Gauleiter and plenipotentiary for labor deployment. Sokol was the brutal procurer, the man who promised to dragoon millions of fresh slaves from the east, and he did so with savage enthusiasm, combing through villages and rounding up men, women, and children like cattle. Speer was the consummate manager, the distributor of this human raw material. His ministry decided which factories, which projects, were most critical to the war effort and thus received the precious, and expendable, resource of labor. The scale was staggering. By 1944, over 7 million foreign civilian laborers and 2 million prisoners of war were toiling within the Reich. But the most damning chapter was written by the concentration camp inmates. Spee's ministry, specifically his chief engineer, Xaver Dorsch, struck a deal with SS Brigadeführer Hans Kammler, a ruthless technocrat in Himmler's inner circle. The SS would rent out prisoners from its camps to Spee's factories. The currency was lives. This was the birth of the SS Boerbrigaden and the network of subcamps that sprouted like poisonous mushrooms around every major industrial plant. For Spee, this was the ultimate in efficiency, a workforce that required no wages, could be housed in squalid barracks, fed starvation rations, and worked until it collapsed, at which point it could be replaced from the endless supply provided by the SS. He saw this system with his own eyes. His visit to the Mittelwerk factory near Nordhorsen in December 1943 remains one of the most indelible stains on his record. Here, in a vast, subterranean tunnel system, the V-2 rocket, his and Hitler's wonder weapon, was being assembled. The factory was a dystopian vision. The air was thick with rock dust and the smell of death. Emaciated prisoners, skeletons clad in rags, worked under the whips of SS guards. The mortality rate was astronomical, prisoners died of exhaustion, disease, starvation, and summary execution. Spee walked through this hell. He later claimed he was shocked and depressed, that he gave orders to improve conditions. But the evidence tells a different story. In the cold calculus of his ministry, the V-2 program took precedence. The rockets continued to be built, and the prisoners continued to die. His concern was a performative gesture, a piece of self-administered moral anesthesia. The production schedule was what mattered. This was the core of the moral abyss over which Spee presided. He was not a frothing ideologue like Hitler, nor a fanatical racist like Himmler. His complicity was of a different, more modern, and in some ways more terrifying kind. It was the complicity of the technocrat. He abstracted human beings into units of production. In his memos and meetings, people became labor quoters, man-hours, or human material. He engaged in detailed discussions about the caloric intake of workers, not out of compassion, but to determine the minimum sustenance required to maintain a baseline level of productivity before the worker was expended. He argued with Sokal not over the morality of slavery, but over the distribution of slaves, complaining that the quality of laborers was poor or that they were arriving in insufficient numbers. His defense, both at the time and later at Nuremberg, was one of deliberate ignorance and compartmentalization. He claimed he did not know the full extent of the brutality. He claimed that the worst atrocities were the purview of the SS, and that his responsibility ended at the factory gate. This was their secret in the factory that he desperately tried to keep, even from himself. But the secret was an open one. The streams of ragged, starving prisoners marching through German towns were visible to all. The smoke from the crematoria at camps like Dora Mittelbau, built to serve his factories, filled the air. Spee, the man with unparalleled access to information, the master of complex systems, asked the world to believe he saw only the output, never the input. The truth was that Albert Speer knew. He knew enough. He knew that his miracle of production was built on a foundation of torture and mass death. He chose not to know more, because to fully acknowledge the reality would have made it impossible for him to continue his work. The moral abyss was not a distant chasm into which he accidentally stumbled, it was a calculated cost of doing business. The factory, which should represent human progress, became, under his management, a mechanism for human destruction. The secret was not hidden in the files, it was hidden in plain sight, buried beneath the relentless, deafening noise of production targets met and quotas fulfilled. It was the sound of humanity being crushed in the gears of the machine he so expertly commanded. By the early months of 1945, the Third Reich was a corpse twitching in its death throes. The once mighty Wehrmacht was a shattered force, retreating on all fronts. The cities of Germany lay in ruins, their rubble monuments to the Allied bombing campaign that Spee's own armaments had been unable to prevent. And deep beneath the Chancellery Garden in Berlin, in a claustrophobic world of reinforced concrete, buzzing generators, and stale air, the final act of the Nazi drama was being played out. It was here, in the Führerbunker, that the last, and most profound, confrontation between Albert Speer and Adolf Hitler occurred. The subject was not how to win the war, but how to manage the annihilation. The architect who had dreamed of building Germania was now locked in a struggle with his patron over the manner of their nation's suicide. The catalyst for this final breach was Hitler's Nero Decree, issued on March 19, 1945. Named for the Roman emperor who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, the order was a directive for national self-immolation. It commanded the destruction of all industrial plants, all important electrical facilities, waterworks, gasworks, stores of food and clothing, and all bridges, railways, and communications installations within the Reich. The logic was as nihilistic as it was simple. If the German people had proven too weak to win the war, they deserved to be stripped of all means of survival and left to face the vengeance of the enemy. The nation was to be transformed into a scorched desert. For Speer, this was the ultimate madness, the final, terrifying confirmation of the detachment from reality he had first glimpsed at Stalingrad. As Minister of Armaments, he understood with chilling clarity what this decree meant: the literal extinction of the German people. Without infrastructure, food, or power, millions would perish in the ensuing chaos from starvation, disease, and exposure. The war was lost, but this decree promised a catastrophe that would extend for generations. It was an act of pathological vengeance against the German people themselves. His opposition began not with secret plots, but with open, reasoned argument, the only language he truly understood. He composed a lengthy, devastating memorandum to Hitler, a masterpiece of cold, technical analysis. He argued that the destruction of the infrastructure would not militarily hinder the enemy for more than a few weeks, but it would ensure that the German people will be robbed of all possibility of survival in the foreseeable future. He pointed out that without electricity, water, and transport, there could be no agriculture, no distribution of food, and no recovery. It was a plea from the rational technocrat to the apocalyptic ideologue, and it fell on deaf ears. Hitler dismissed it with fury. The people had failed him, let them be destroyed. Faced with this intractable fanaticism, Speer's loyalty, already fractured, finally snapped. He made a conscious, treasonous decision. He would actively work to subvert the Nero Decree. This was not an act of high-minded moral resistance in the traditional sense, it was a desperate, pragmatic attempt to save what he called the biological substance of the German nation from its own leadership. He embarked on a frantic, perilous tour of the collapsing fronts, flying and driving into combat zones to meet with the generals and Gauleiters who held the power of destruction. His methods were a blend of persuasion, authority, and deception. To the fanatical Gauleiters, like Karl Kaufmann in Hamburg, he used his remaining prestige as Hitler's favorite to argue, cajole, and threaten. He presented himself as the bearer of the real Führer's will, exploiting the chaotic chain of command. To the military commanders, many of whom shared his pragmatic desire to avoid pointless destruction, he offered technical arguments and his personal assurance that they would not be held responsible for disobeying the order. He worked in concert with a network of sympathetic industrialists who had no desire to see their life's work obliterated. In the Ruhr Valley, in the Saar, and across Germany, he gave the same order: ignore the Nero Decree. Do not blow up the bridges. Do not destroy the power plants. Do not flood the mines. The most dramatic confrontation occurred back in the bunker on March 28 and 29, 1945. Summoned by Hitler, Speer was forced to confess that he had deliberately disobeyed the decree and had actively worked against its implementation. The scene was surreal. The man who had built the Cathedral of Light now stood in the oppressive underground chamber, defending his treason to the enraged, crumbling dictator. Hitler, pale and trembling, accused him of betraying the cause. He demanded that Speer publicly affirm his belief in ultimate victory, a lie that Speer, for the first time, refused to tell. Yet, in a testament to the strange, personal bond that still connected them, Hitler could not bring himself to order Speer's execution. He simply banished him from his presence, telling him to leave the bunker. The relationship was over. Speer's sabotage of the Nero Decree was his most significant, and arguably his only truly moral, act in the final years of the war. It was not born of a sudden conversion to democratic principles or a full reckoning with the regime's crimes. It was the act of a manager who saw a catastrophic system failure and moved to contain the damage. He sought to preserve the physical infrastructure necessary for life, believing that a nation, unlike a regime, could one day be rebuilt. In the heart of the Nazi volcano, as the lava of destruction flowed, Albert Speer chose, at last, to try and save the village, even as he had helped stoke the eruption. It was an ambiguous, complicated act of defiance that would forever define his complex legacy, the man who knew Germany had lost, and who, in the final hour, sought to ensure there would be a Germany left to lose. The dock at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was the final, and most consequential, stage upon which Albert Speer would perform. The man who had orchestrated the German war economy now faced judgment from the victorious Allies for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The other defendants, the fanatical Göring, the raptorial Hess, the rabid Streicher, represented the grotesque and unrepentant face of the Third Reich. Speer understood that to stand among them was to share their fate. What followed was not merely a legal defense, but a masterpiece of strategic self-reinvention, a carefully crafted and brilliantly executed performance designed to create a new, enduring persona, the good Nazi. In the crucible of Nuremberg, the architect did not build with brick and steel, but with words, nuance, and a calculated admission of guilt that would save his neck and shape his historical legacy for decades. From the very beginning, Speer's approach was diametrically opposed to that of his co-defendants. Where Hermann Göring sought to defiantly justify the Nazi cause and bully the others into a united front of defiance, Speer positioned himself as the contrite, cooperative technocrat. He did not rant against the court's legitimacy. Instead, he acknowledged its authority and, in a stunning move, accepted a broad, philosophical, collective responsibility for the horrors of the regime. This was the cornerstone of his defense strategy. By accepting a general share of the blame, he sought to create a contrast so sharp with the others that the judges would see him as fundamentally different. He was not denying the crimes, he was presenting himself as the one man in the dock morally astute enough to acknowledge the system's evil. This admission of collective responsibility was, however, meticulously fenced. It was a moral admission, not a legal one. He carefully separated this overarching guilt from direct, criminal culpability for specific atrocities, most notably the Holocaust. This is where his performance reached its most sophisticated and controversial pitch. He admitted to using slave labor, framing it as a grim necessity of war undertaken for the survival of his nation. But he flatly denied any knowledge of the final solution. He claimed that the extermination of the Jews was a secret so closely guarded by Himmler's SS that he, a high-ranking minister, was kept entirely in the dark. He presented himself as an apolitical manager, so engrossed in production graphs and technical problems that he failed to see the genocidal machine operating in the shadows just beyond his factory walls. The performance was devastatingly effective. He was calm, articulate, and logical where others were emotional and evasive. He provided the tribunal with detailed, valuable information about the inner workings of the Nazi state, further burnishing his image as a cooperative witness for truth. He even took the extraordinary step of directly criticizing Hitler from the stand, not as a betrayed follower, but as a man who had seen the error of his ways. He spoke of the criminality of the regime and expressed his belief that Hitler, had he been victorious, would have descended into a madness that would have consumed Germany entirely. This was not the testimony of a loyal Nazi, it was the testimony of a repentant German. His greatest moment of theater came during his final statement. While the other defendants offered justifications, excuses, or rambling ideological screeds, Speer delivered a cool, calculated speech that perfectly encapsulated his defense. The trial is necessary, he declared. There is a common responsibility for such horrible crimes even in an authoritarian state. He spoke of the danger of technology in the service of a tyrannical state, a warning that resonated deeply in the dawning atomic age. He presented himself as a cautionary tale, the modern man seduced by power and efficiency, who had lost his moral compass. It was a narrative the world was ready to hear. The court was convinced, at least partially. They saw through his denial of knowledge of the Holocaust, finding his claims of ignorance implausible given his position. His use of slave labor was, in itself, a massive war crime. For this, he was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Yet, in the context of Nuremberg, this was a victory. He had escaped the gallows that claimed his fellow architects of the regime like Göring, by suicide, Kaltenbrunner, and Jodl. The sentence was a testament to the power of his performance. The judges had drawn a distinction between the unrepentant fanatic and the seemingly remorseful technician. Their Nuremberg performance was Albert Speer's ultimate architectural achievement. He constructed a persona that would shield him from execution and define him for posterity. He became their good Nazi, the one who said he was sorry, the one who warned the world about the dangers of technology divorced from morality. It was a brilliant, cynical, and ultimately successful act of self-preservation. He had managed to confess enough to seem credible, while denying enough to avoid the noose. He presented himself not as a monster, but as a mirror in which the modern world, a world of bureaucracy, technology, and moral ambiguity, could see a terrifying, and strangely comforting, reflection of itself. The comfort lay in the implication that such evil could be committed not only by fanatics, but by civilized men who simply failed to ask the right questions. It was a truth, but one that Speer wielded not as a penance, but as a shield. For 20 years in Spandau prison and for the remainder of his life as a free man, Albert Speer meticulously tended to the garden of his own legacy. The persona he had sculpted at Nuremberg, the repentant technocrat, the good Nazi who accepted collective responsibility, hardened into accepted historical fact in the public consciousness. He became a best-selling author, a sought-after interviewee, the eloquent warning from a heart of darkness. He presented himself as a man haunted, a figure who had spent decades in soul-searching contemplation of his guilt. This was the myth of the repentant man, and it was perhaps the most durable and insidious of all his creations. But as historians began to peel back the layers of his carefully constructed narrative, a very different picture emerged, one that suggested his repentance was not a genuine moral reckoning, but a continuation of the same calculated performance that had begun in the Nuremberg dock. The central pillar of Speer's myth was his claimed ignorance of the Holocaust. He expressed shock and horror upon learning of the extermination camps after the war, positioning himself as a man who had been in the room yet managed to miss the single greatest crime of the regime. This claim, however, collapses under the weight of evidence. As Minister of Armaments and a member of the highest echelons of power, he was present at the Posen Conference on October 6, 1944, where Heinrich Himmler explicitly detailed the extermination of the Jews to an assembly of Gauleiters and senior officials. Himmler's speech was stark. The grave matter was to make the decision to cause this people to disappear from the earth. You are all witnesses that this has been carried out. For Speer to claim he left the room before this part of the speech, or that he somehow missed its significance, defies belief. He was a man renowned for his grasp of detail, a master of complex systems. The idea that he remained oblivious to the systematic murder of millions whose labor he directly exploited is not a credible defense, but a legal strategy. His knowledge was not merely passive. His actions implicate him directly in the machinery of genocide. The expansion of the Auschwitz camp complex in 1942-43 was intimately tied to his ministry's demands for synthetic rubber, Buna, and fuel. Speer's department approved the allocations of materials and manpower for the construction of the very industrial facilities at Auschwitz II Monowitz that were powered by the theft and murder of the camp's inmates. He was not a distant observer of the Holocaust. His industrial empire was physically and functionally intertwined with it. He knew the source of his labor. Memos from his own ministry discussed the evacuation of Jews from Berlin to make way for his grandiose architectural plans, a euphemism he understood perfectly well. His sin was not ignorance, it was willful, strategic blindness, a conscious decision to not ask questions to which he did not want to know the answers. This leads to the deconstruction of his famous acceptance of responsibility. At Nuremberg and in his memoirs, Speer masterfully employed the language of guilt without the substance of legal culpability. His admission of collective responsibility was a brilliant rhetorical sleight of hand. It was a vague, philosophical concept that sounded like a profound mea culpa but was deliberately designed to avoid specific, indictable crimes. By accepting a share of a generalized guilt, he evaded being pinned down for the specific, knowing authorization of slave labor under conditions of genocide or complicity in mass murder. It was a moral smoke screen for a legal defense. He confessed to the sin of pride, of being seduced by power, of failing morally, sins for which one cannot be hanged. He steadfastly denied the crimes of knowledge, complicity, and murder, crimes for which one could. Even his post-war repentance reveals itself, upon closer examination, to be a carefully managed public relations campaign. His contrition was always conditional and self-serving. In his writings and interviews, he consistently separated himself from the real Nazis, the crude, ideological fanatics like Göring and Himmler. He presented his own failings as those of a modern man, a warning about the dangers of technology, thereby making his story relevant and intellectually palatable to a new generation. He became a celebrity of conscience, but his remorse was always directed at the abstract, German people, and the grand tragedy of the war. It was rarely, if ever, directed with specific empathy toward his millions of actual victims, the slave laborers worked to death in his factories, the Jews whose extermination he claimed not to have known about. His repentance was for the downfall of a great nation, not for the specific, agonizing deaths of individuals. The myth of the repentant man was, therefore, the ultimate extension of the illusion Speer had cultivated since the 1930s. The cultured, apolitical architect became the remorseful, philosophical prisoner. He used his intellect and his charm not to expose the full truth of the regime, but to carefully curate a version of it that allowed him to survive, both physically and historically. He succeeded in convincing many that he was a tragic figure who had learned from his mistakes. In reality, he was the same pragmatic manager, now managing his own legacy. He understood that in the post-war world, a show of repentance was his most valuable currency. By offering the world a Nazi it could feel comfortable condemning, one who seemed to agree with the condemnation, Albert Speer achieved his final and most cynical victory. He escaped the gallows not just of Nuremberg, but of history itself, for a time. He perfected the blueprint for how a perpetrator could repackage himself as a penitent, a warning that the most dangerous lies are often those we are most eager to believe. The story of Albert Speer does not conclude with a neat verdict or a settled historical account. It ends with a lingering, dissonant question mark. His life presents us with two profoundly conflicting narratives, and the choice between them speaks as much to our own understanding of evil, guilt, and redemption as it does to their historical record. Was Albert Speer the repentant technocrat, the good Nazi who embodied the moral seduction of modernity and offered the world a cautionary tale in the form of a sincere, lifelong penance? Or was he the ultimate opportunist, a man whose greatest and most enduring construction was not Germania, but a meticulously crafted lie, a lie that allowed him to outsmart justice, manipulate history, and die in his bed as a respected elder statesman of guilt? The final blueprint he left behind is not for a building, but for a legacy of lies, and its foundations are cracked beyond repair. The portrait of the repentant man is, on its surface, compelling. It is the story Speer himself told in his best-selling memoirs, Inside the Third Reich and Spandau, The Secret Diaries. Here, he is the brilliant young architect seduced by the promise of artistic glory, who ascends to a position of immense power only to gradually awaken to the monstrous reality around him. This Speer is the one who defied Hitler's Nero decree, who accepted collective responsibility at Nuremberg, and who spent his 20 years in Spandau in deep, philosophical contemplation of his moral failure. He presented himself as a warning, a symbol of how a civilized man, lured by the allure of efficiency and power, could become complicit in unparalleled barbarity without being a barbarian himself. This narrative was, and remains, powerfully seductive. It offers a comforting distance from the Holocaust, suggesting that such evil could be perpetrated not just by rabid ideologues, but by people who look and think like us, that the danger is not otherness, but ambition divorced from morality. Yet, a closer examination of this blueprint reveals fatal flaws in its design. The central pillar of his repentance, his claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, has been systematically dismantled by historians. Evidence, most notably his presence at the Posen Conference in 1944 where Himmler explicitly detailed the extermination of the Jews, renders his protestations of ignorance not just implausible, but demonstrably false. His complicity was not passive. His armaments empire was physically and functionally intertwined with the machinery of genocide. The expansion of Auschwitz to serve the Bühner works, the memos from his ministry discussing the evacuation of Jews, and his direct management of a slave labor system with a known, astronomical mortality rate all point to a man who knew enough. He knew that the engine of his production miracle was fueled by human suffering on an industrial scale. His ignorance was a conscious, strategic choice, a survival mechanism that began during the war and became the cornerstone of his legal defense. This leads to the inescapable conclusion that Spee's repentance was not a genuine moral awakening, but the ultimate act of a master tactician. Having realized that the war was lost as early as Stalingrad, he began a long, calculated campaign to secure his own future. His opposition to the Nero decree, while saving countless German lives, can also be seen as a strategic investment in his own post-war credibility, an act designed to create a record of defiance. His performance at Nuremberg was a masterpiece of this strategy. By accepting a vague, collective responsibility, he performed contrition without admitting to specific, hangable crimes. He offered the judges a narrative they desperately needed, a high-ranking insider who condemned the regime and could explain its inner workings without the frothing ideology of a Göring. He gave them a Nazi they could understand, and in doing so, he gave them a reason to let him live. In his post-war life, Spee did not retreat into obscurity. He became a master of the interview, the book tour, the public meditation on guilt. He sold repentance, and the world bought it. He understood that in the new, post-war Germany and among a curious international public, the market for a monstrous Nazi was limited, but the market for a complex, repentant one was boundless. He meticulously curated his archives, controlling the narrative from beyond the grave. He presented his story not as that of a war criminal, but as a Greek tragedy of hubris and fall, with himself as the flawed, yet ultimately wise, protagonist. So, what is the final verdict on the man who knew Germany had lost? The evidence points overwhelmingly to the figure of the ultimate opportunist. Albert Speer was a man of immense talent, intellect, and charm, but he was devoid of a moral core. His only true loyalty was to his own ambition and preservation. He served Hitler with brilliant efficiency as long as it served his purpose, and he condemned him with eloquent remorse when that served his purpose better. He knew Germany had lost, and in the end, the only thing he truly fought to save was Albert Speer. His legacy, therefore, is not a warning about the dangers of technology, as he so often claimed. It is a far more disturbing warning about the power of a persuasive lie. It is a lesson in how a handsome, intelligent, and well-spoken man can whitewash his soul, rewrite his history, and deceive the world into believing in his redemption. The final blueprint he leaves us is not one of stone and steel, but of duplicity and moral evasion. It is the blueprint of a man who was not sorry for what he did, but only sorry that he was caught, and who possessed the genius to convince almost everyone, perhaps even, at times, himself, otherwise. The enduring controversy of his legacy is the measure of his success. He outsmarted the gallows, but in the court of history, his lies are his lasting, and most damning, monument.